Cornel West is one of this decade's most interesting voices. His writings have covered everything from the black church to Marxist theory to jazz music. He's recently collected a wide range of his pieces in a new book called The Cornel West Reader. You'll also be hearing from him because he is a kind of friend, very much a friend, and also an unofficial advisor to presidential candidate Senator Bill Bradley. I am pleased to have my friend Cornel West back at this table. Welcome.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Deeply appreciate you having me.
Well, listen, now what causes a man to put together all of the stuff that he's written, and you have written a lot. You know, you started, and you had been a voice that we have seen in lots of places, to put it together in what is called a reader.
Well, it's, of course, selections.
Right. I know it's not it. It's not the sum total of what you've
you got
said.
certain slices.
Now, but the point is to do what? To show your intellectual growth? Or
no, you want something that's accessible to large numbers of persons, and you want to give people a sense of the different voices that you're putting forward. Oftentimes you get pigeonholed in American culture.
Right.
You get pigeonholed in American intellectual life. And I simply wanted to provide an occasion, and actually I've got this wonderful editor, Brother Tim Bartlett, who put forward the idea, and it struck me as a good one. And I said, sure, let's see where it goes.
All right, so here's my question. I mean, how have you been pigeonholed? Because they view you, there's a perception of you as what?
Perception as either just race man, or just Christian, or just pragmatist, or just radical Democrat, or just black man. And I'm all of those things, and a lover of John Coltrane.
Well,
so
I know
the question
that,
becomes,
yes.
Are you able to lay bare some of the various dimensions and aspects of who you are as a human being, as well as the various labels that people will deploy?
All right, listen to this. This is the dedication, I think. Is this the dedication of this book? Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is the dedication.
Well, you can read Chekhov. Oh, my God.
All right, here's what I'm getting to. To the memory and legacy of my modern artistic soulmates. Begins with Coltrane, and then goes through Kafka and through Tennessee Williams and Sarah Vaughan and Toni Morrison, and then it says, and above all, Anton Chekhov.
Yes, indeed.
Why above all Chekhov?
Well, Chekhov for me is the greatest artist of late modernity. That he's not only at the formal level able to democratize and decentralize caste and deformalize dialogue, so that the everyday, the quotidian, what was once perceived as the undramatic, becomes central. But most importantly, he's able to accent the ways in which we can sustain compassion and hope in the face of overwhelming disappointment and disenchantment.
How do we do that? Through Chekhov's
You do
wisdom.
it through the spiritual strength, like the three sisters who never get to Moscow. They hold on to each other for dear life. They dig deep in their souls, and they forge some sense of stamina and endurance and persistence, or what Curtis Mayfield said, keep keeping on.
Keep on
pushing.
That's what he said.
Chekhov is a blues man in that regard.
Now, what is it that these artistic soulmates share? What's the common linkage there, you think, between a Coltrane and a Tennessee Williams and a Sarah Vaughan and a Toni Morrison and a Thomas Hardy and a
They
Chekhov?
all are great poets of death, of compassion, and of struggle. That they understand very clearly when Plato said philosophy is a preparation for and a meditation on death, or when Montaigne says to philosophize to learn how to die, or when Seneca says he or she who learns how to die unlearn slavery. The connection between confronting death and wrestling with one's own freedom, trying to forge a courage to be, a courage to love, a courage to fight for justice. You find in Soyinka, in Morrison, it's certainly in Faulkner, it's certainly in Lorca. One can go on.
You have called yourself and characterized yourself as a Chekhovian Christian.
That's right.
What's that?
That's right.
In addition to what you've already said.
It's a Christian who is preoccupied with the underside of the human condition, the dark side of the human predicament. Another way of putting it is, it's a Christian who's wrestling with the Saturday between Good Friday and Easter. Most American Christians are post-resurrection Christians. That is to say, they're concerned with the winter. They're concerned with Jesus after Easter.
Right.
Where the Chekhovian Christian says, look, God is dead on that Saturday, and we have to come to terms with the relative impotence of good. We're looking for some power. We're lured by some possibility. Right. But Good Friday was real. It was the death of God. And that Saturday after is real. It's almost like Beckett's Didi and Golgo, Waiting for Godot. We're wrestling with that Saturday. A Jacobian Christian says, we are going to wrestle with the distress, the death, disease, despair on that Saturday, looking for possibility by means of our stepping out on nothing and landing on something. And that, for me, is really at the heart of the gospel. It's a very different interpretation than most of my fellow Christians.
We have talked about this many times before. You describe yourself clearly as a socialist, but not a Marxist.
Or a radical Democrat.
Or a radical...
Absolutely right.
What's the difference in a radical Democrat and a
socialist? Because a radical Democrat comes out of the tradition of Walt Whitman and W.B. Du Bois and Gertrude Stein and John Dewey and Reinhold Niebuhr, early Niebuhr, and which is to say it puts the stress on the empowerment of the demos, the rule of the demos. Very much like what's going on in Seattle right now, right? Corporate elites, bank elites, shaping the world in their image and interest. Demos emerge and says, look, there's people out here. There's workers out here. There's environment out here. There's consumer protections that ought to be acknowledged. The demos is the energy from below that says we're going to keep track of the least of these, especially those who are suffering. The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, to be in solidarity with the least of these. Christian insight, actually from the rich prophetic Judaic insight, right? That justice rolled down like waters and righteousness, like a mighty stream. Do justly, love mercifully, walk humbly with thy God. That is the prophetic element. And I in no way view myself as a prophet, but my God, I want to be a small part of a prophetic tradition. Yeah. And a progressive tradition.
When you look at all these things that you have written about, I mean, look at this. This book is divided into the whole series of autobiographical prelude, modernity and its discontents, American pragmatism, progressive Marxist theory, radical democratic politics, prophetic Christian thought, the arts, race and difference, and a whole series of conversation people with Bell Brooks. And then you conclude with postscript, Chekhov, Coltrane, and democracy. In stitching this together, you know, is there here, you know, a one strong river that all these things flow into? And what is the component of that river? Is there one, in a sense, have you put this framework together so that it makes each of its elements contribute to its whole?
Yeah, I think it can be put this way, though, brother, that I am trying to be true to the blue note that black people injected into Western musical harmonies. The blue note is a note of dissonance, disturbance, defiance, a darkness that unveils some of the lies that America has told itself about its sunshine. And that's not a trashing of America, it is a critique of America. It's like Martin King. My dream is not the American dream, it is rooted in the American dream. It's a dialectical critique of the American dream. It will appropriate certain elements, but it will go beyond it. In my work, it's simply to say, look, can I be true to that blue note? I mean, that's why Coltrane is not just an ornament, right? Can I be true to the truth-telling of that darkness that forces us to deal with the disruption and subversion of the mendacity and hypocrisy and falsity in American life? Now, American life is more than just those things, but there's a lot of those things in American life, you see. And so it's the art of living, you know, why live, how to live wisely, lovingly, and it's the expansion of democracy, you see. The demos and all of their wonderfulness and horribleness and their virtues and vices serving as the very basis upon which self-government, self-management, not just here, but around the world.
How did you come to know and support and advise Bill Bradley?
Yeah, Brother Bradley is, we met 10 years ago that he brought together a small group that would meet every 4 months. We did this for about 5 years. Richard Rorty, my dear friend and brother and mentor, was one. Ann Swetler, who teaches at Berkeley, wrote the wonderful book with Bob Bellow, Habits of the Heart. David Okamoto, who heads East Asian Studies at Stanford, who actually was a roommate of Brother Bill Bradley. And last but not least, the distinguished historian, James McPherson. Right. We would meet every 4 months, reflecting on philosophy, political theory, cultural criticism. This started
10 years ago?
It was about 9 years ago, actually.
And you'd meet once every 4 months?
Every 4 months.
Over dinner?
Well, it was dinner or whatever, because we'd meet for 2 days. And we socialized.
This was like a weekend together.
It was a weekend. We socialized. You see, they could come to my house. We'd go to Bradley's house. We'd engage with Sister Ernestine, who you know is a superb scholar in her own right. And so we got to know each other as human beings, as brothers, as friends, as sisters. And he never talked about the presidency or anything. He was one conversational partner among the others. But it was fairly clear that he was serious about his calling. He was digging deep in his soul, and that's one of the things that I like about him.
What was his calling?
His calling was as public servant, whatever form that takes. You see, whatever form that takes. And I told him then, I said, as public servant, it's so rare to find a statesperson in American politics. And by statesperson, what I mean is someone not simply concerned with public interest, not simply someone who speaks to American people as human beings and citizens, but more importantly, like a jazz musician, like the best of the jazz musicians who are sure of themselves. Most of American politicians are like the young pop stars. Yeah. They don't know who they are, and they're in search of who they are, and they have some spinsters and posters to tell them who they are. But I say, no, I want a jazz musician-like politician. That is to say, you know who you are, you've engaged in the Keatsian soul wrestling, you dipped your intelligence in the world of pain and trouble, and out came a self. And therefore, you're secure. You're still open for criticism, but you're still secure. Now go out and be yourself. It's not this little buzzword of authenticity these days.
And Bill Bradley knows himself?
Oh, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Man, he's got a sense of himself, whether he's running for president or not. You see, it's not contingent on just context. He's dug deep into the wells of his soul, deep within the precincts of his personality, and out has come integrity, a dignity, not perfection, but an integrity and a dignity that has to do with a vision linked to public interest and common good. And that's a rare thing. It really is. And that's one of the reasons why I support him as a human being at the level of character and integrity as well as politician. Of course, he and I have many disagreements, and that's the way it ought to be. I'm a radical Democrat. He is an experimental liberal. That's fine. He ought to have people around.
An experimental liberal. Is that how is that self-defined, or
no? That's how I would view it. I mean, like Roosevelt. Roosevelt had a flexibility, an experimental and improvisational disposition in order to bring together a variety of different peoples. Bill Bradley can bring moderates together. He can bring liberals together. He can bring radical Democrats like myself. None of us ought to be predominant or so hegemonic, because that's the quest for purity. That's not what American democratic politics are about. It's about bringing all of these persons together under a leader, you see, so that you can imagine. I mean, as a good friend and brother, I'll always have my criticism, of course. He will respond back. But that's the way it ought to be. But I am very much not just part of the bandwagon, but want to see him walk into the White House to make this country a more free and democratic place.
Well, I mean, he has said an interesting thing about race.
Yes.
Interesting, though, as of this day, the majority, the polls show Vice President Gore doing better with African Americans.
Absolutely right. You know why?
No, I don't.
Not enough black people know Bill Bradley. Only 44% even know who he is,
and that's,
you see.
Hence a role for you.
That's a fundamental role for me and Roger Wilkins and a whole host of others.
You and Roger Wilkins, and who else is on that
Clifford
team?
Alexander, Mark Alexander. Bill Bradley's got, of course, a black
Mark Alexander is his issues guy.
His
son of
We've
Cliff
got
Alexander.
Jacques DeGraff, of course, who's a black brother who's running the delegates. You've got a treasurer, Brother Wells, Ted Wells, a black treasurer.
Lawyer from
Black
New Jersey.
folk are in on the process as well as the larger ends and aims. You see, it's not a question of trying to just bring in certain elements in a constituency and make it visible. They are integral because they're part and parcel of the Bradley campaign. All of us having that kind of equal status, putting the focus not even so much just on Bradley, but on the issues as he addresses the issues.
But do you go out to speak to your black brothers and sisters and say to them, Bill... You do, don't you?
Oh, indeed. But what I say, when I go out, what I say is...
I know what you say.
I'm looking at Brother Bill Bradley through the lens of that blue note. Is he the best candidate who puts the limelight on the social misery in our midst, on working people, on issues that ought to bring us together, the glue and cement that bring us together rather than what divides us? That's the lens. So it's not the kind of I mean, you got a lot of connection of different advisors who themselves aren't clear about the larger criteria that one appeals to evaluate a candidate. I believe that Al Gore is a very decent human being. I've met him many times. He's invited me to the mansion. He's a very decent
Vice presidential mansion?
Oh, yes.
Did you go?
Oh, of course I went. We had wonderful dialogues.
Yeah. And
his wife, Tipper, and his both daughters at Harvard. I've had a number of my classes and so on.
Right.
But the question is, who is the statesman who ought to be the next president? It's not who is the politician who is smart and clever.
You don't think Gore is a statesman?
Well, he might have the potential. I haven't seen it as yet, but I'm sure that Bradley is.
Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic, A, about America, and B, forget the candidates, and B, about race and some coming to closure?
Well, one, for me, the categories of pessimism and optimism are flip sides of the same coin, and I push it aside. For me, it's all about hope.
Okay. Is there hope?
It's all about hope. And we have some great seeds of hope. Now, on the other hand, no hope without despair, right? Goethe says, he who has never despaired has no need to have lived. He's absolutely right. We wrestle with despair all the time, but we have tremendous seeds of hope. Why? Because there are fellow citizens who are visionary, courageous, who do believe that the democratic project is worth fighting for, dying for, and in fact see it not simply just for America, but for the world. That is the best of the American democratic tradition, and there are millions of Americans who do believe this. Many sometimes feeling a bit impotent and helpless at times, trade union movement, feminist movement, anti-homophobic movement, black freedom movement, but they're around, and I am hopeful in that regard, but I must say we're cutting against the grain, though, Charlie. You know, you got 3 billionaires in the world who have more net worth than the bottom 48 countries. We got 200 million individuals who are of more net worth than 41% of humankind, 2.6 billion people. That's the level of inequality we're dealing with. That's the kind of work that radical Democrats have.
So what would a radical Democrat do about that? Would he take from those billionaires?
No, not at all. It must be democratic and constitutional. We're talking about investment in people, education, infrastructure, you see, health care, investment so that they can help themselves, but help themselves with dignity, help themselves with an integrity. But we in a situation now where what? Most of the investment goes into what? Material toys. For who? Those who can consume. Upper middle classes in Brazil, slice of bourgeoisies in Africa, they're the only ones who can even consume most of the goods. But they have basic social needs that are not being satisfied. Shelter, health care, food. You see what I mean? 200 million fellow human beings living in poverty. This very moment. We've got a long way to go, but I am full of hope.
Well, not only that, you've also been full of I mean, you have been as strongly speaking to the question of race in America. You've also been authentic in terms of criticizing where you thought criticism was necessary and pointing out to the danger of nihilism.
Absolutely right.
Pointing out the danger of anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
Pointing out
any form of bigotry.
The danger of any form of
against
bigotry.
Gay brothers, lesbian sisters, elderly, Jews, black people, red people, brown people. But that's just a matter of being both humanist and Christian in that regard. But I do believe also that there's a connection between the expansion of democracy and the minimizing of vicious legacies of white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, heterosexism, vast economic inequality, and environmental abuse. There is a connection between those two. That's what connects Louis Armstrong with Walt Whitman, with Gertrude Stein. You see that they all go hand in hand because they're all trying to understand the various dimensions of this most precious of ideals, the democratic ideal.
The Cornel West Reader by Cornel West, who is the Alphonse what? You're the Alphonse
Fletcher Jr.
Fletcher Jr.
University professor. But I mean,
professor
that's the important
at Harvard
thing
University. Alphonse Fletcher Jr., university professor at Harvard University. And his books include The American Evasion of Philosophy, The Future of the Race with Henry Louis Gates Jr., and also Race Matters. Cornel West, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Always a blessing, my brother.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time. Cornel West is one of this decade's most interesting voices. His writings have covered everything from the black church to Marxist theory to jazz music. He's recently collected a wide range of his pieces in a new book called The Cornel West Reader. You'll also be hearing from him because he is a kind of friend, very much a friend, and also an unofficial advisor to presidential candidate Senator Bill Bradley. I am pleased to have my friend Cornel West back at this table. Welcome.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Deeply appreciate you having me.
Well, listen, now what causes a man to put together all of the stuff that he's written, and you have written a lot. You know, you started, and you had been a voice that we have seen in lots of places. To put it together in a view as what?
Perception as either just race man, or just Christian, or just pragmatist, or just radical Democrat, or just black man. And I'm all of those things, and a lover of John Coltrane.
Well,
so the question becomes, yes, are you able to lay bare some of the various dimensions and aspects of who you are as a human being, as well as the various labels that people will deploy?
All right, listen to this. This is the dedication, I think. Is this the dedication of this book? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a dedication.
Well, you can read Chekhov. Oh, my God.
All right, here's what I'm getting to. To the memory and legacy of my modern artistic soulmates. Begins with Coltrane, and then goes through Kafka and through Tennessee Williams and Sarah Vaughan and Toni Morrison, and then it says, and above all, Anton Chekhov.
Yes, indeed.
Why above all Chekhov?
Well, Chekhov for me is the greatest artist of late modernity. That he's not only at the formal level able to democratize and decentralize caste and deformalize dialogue, so that the everyday, the quotidian, what was once perceived as the undramatic, becomes central. But most importantly, he's able to accent the ways in which we can sustain compassion and hope in the face of overwhelming disappointment and disenchantment.
How do we do that? Through Chekhov's
You do
wisdom.
it through the spiritual strength, like the three sisters who never get to Moscow. They hold on to each other for dear life. They dig deep in their souls and they forge some sense of stamina and endurance and persistence, or what Curtis Mayfield said, keep keeping on.
Keep on pushing. That's what he said.
Chekhov is a blues man in that regard.
Now, what is it that these artistic soulmates share? What's the common linkage there, you think, between a Coltrane and a Tennessee Williams and a Sarah Vaughan and a Toni Morrison and a Thomas Hardy and a
They
Chekhov?
all are great poets of death, of compassion, and of struggle. That they understand very clearly when Plato said philosophy is a preparation for and a meditation on death, or when Montaigne says to philosophize to learn how to die.
What is called a reader.
Well, it's, of course, selections.
Right. No, I know it's not it. This is not the sum total of what you have
got
said.
certain slices.
Now, but the point is to do what? To show your intellectual growth, or?
No, you want something that's accessible to large numbers of persons, and you want to give people a sense of the different voices that you're putting forward. Oftentimes you get pigeonholed in American culture.
Right.
You get pigeonholed in American intellectual life. And I simply wanted to provide an occasion, and actually I've got this wonderful editor, Brother Tim Bartlett, who put forward the idea, and it struck me as a good one. And I said, sure, let's see where it goes.
All right, so here's my question. I mean, how have you been pigeonholed? Because they view you, there's a perception